This is Chattanooga Civics. I'm Nathan Bird. Mayor Kelly is entering his 4th year in office. I sat down with him to discuss the challenges and successes of his previous 3 years in office. We had a lot of ground to cover in this interview, and we changed topics fairly quickly. If you're looking for more in-depth discussion of these topics, I encourage you to look through the Chattanooga Civics backlog. There you can find detailed discussions on issues like homelessness, parks and outdoors, affordable housing, the Broad Street Stadium, and more. I'd like to thank my Patreon supporters, especially the Marks family and Stephen Culp. Patrons get the opportunity to submit questions directly. If you're interested in supporting the show, you can visit patreon.com/chatcivics. All right, Mayor Kelly, thank you for sitting down with me. This is our third time since you've been elected, I believe, and then we did a couple interviews while you were running.
Absolutely.
So we just like doing these kind of yearly updates.
Absolutely.
Just seeing how things are going, following up on old questions, things that tend to fall out of the limelight, especially,
Exactly.
And just see where things are. So thank you for your time. I know you're really busy.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I want to go through... You've put forward the One Chattanooga plan as a framework for your administration,
Yes.
so I think it makes sense as a framework for this interview to just follow up on what you have said are your priorities for this administration.
Yes,
so
indeed.
we're just going to go through more or less in order, and I want to start with building a path to universal early learning. And I'll say at the outset, a lot of these questions were prepared based off of public input. There was a Reddit thread and
Right.
Instagram, and so some of these sections, if you're listening and you're like, why is he asking so many questions about infrastructure and not as many about universal early learning? It's the result of public input. I received a lot of questions about some things and not as many about others. So I do want to cover this, but just briefly and broadly, can you give us an update on the path to universal early learning in Chattanooga?
Well, I mean, at the risk of, I know we have a limited amount of time, but I think I should probably just start by saying, 3 years in, I've learned a lot. I mean, the plan is the plan. I still think these are the big, important strategic drivers. But boy, howdy, all the old adages about the speed of government are true. I mean, again, as we'll see, we've made a lot of progress in some areas, but if we have time, we can talk about the differences between a strong mayor model and a weak mayor model. But, man, it is like moving, rolling multiple rocks up a hill. In some cases, we've made tremendous progress, in some not so much. But starting with universal early learning, that is, the first element of the plan. And basically, it's because of, when I was in the nonprofit world, I determined that is probably the single most important thing that we can affect that's going to improve Chattanooga in the long term, 15, 20 years. And so we are making some great progress there. We now have nearly, I think last count, 656 early learning seats, and the goal this year was 500. Goal next year is to hit 1,000. We've expanded both, and it kind of breaks down into Head Start, which is a federally funded program, and the private market, which a lot of people don't realize is a lot of childcare. It's a very disorganized private market. Head Start, we've gone from, $12 an hour for those people, which is really was the big break on expanding seats because you couldn't get people to do that, to nearly 20. I mean, we paid a supplement to get them to 15 during COVID, and then now we've gotten a grant to get the salary up to nearly 20, which is great. I mean, so we're making great progress in Head Start expansion. But Caritza Mosley-Jones, who leads that, also has had some really great innovations around growing the private market, along with our Director of Entrepreneurship, Sarah Matson, to get more people into the industry and to get more childcare centers opened. It's more difficult, but it's equally important. And in fact, Caritza has had the great idea. She's on the school board as well of opening a Future Ready Institute for early child care at Tyner, which I believe is happening, so that we can get more people into the pipeline. we know again that the first 5 years of life is the most impactful. So that's going to continue to be a priority. But when we came into office and wrote this plan, we were relatively sure of something that didn't wind up happening, which was support from the federal government to expand. And I think that was because they realized that it is a very fractured market, that the way to do that is actually to grow the private side of the market, and that is a much more complicated task.
Right. So that federal support you're talking about, was that a hiccup in your expectations, or is that something
it was
that
definitely
the
a
federal
hiccup.
government has just changed course on completely? Like, is there openness to that kind of support in the future?
I presumably, I mean, there certainly is on our end. But when they were kind of, again, when the federal government was formulating its response to post-COVID incentive, like how do we recover the economy, it just didn't make the cut for whatever reason. And I think but clearly, most OECD countries have some form of universal child care, certainly the ones with the healthiest economies. And so it makes a ton of sense because it is the most impactful and logical investment that a society can make. So I certainly hope the feds have kept it on the table, but I think it has to do with the difficulties in deploying those resources.
Right. So I want to move on to the next point, which is catalyzing economic vitality in the Black community. Specifically, we've seen a lot of movement around the One Chattanooga plan, which is the combination of the Bend and the West Side and revitalizing that area. One of the oldest, if not the oldest, public housing project in the city.
Yes.
And that project, the One West Side plan, has been the most obvious of all these ways of catalyzing economic vitality in these communities. But are there any less well-covered investments that are being made in other neighborhoods that you would like to highlight?
I mean, it's complicated and difficult work. So you can define it, and we do. We think of it very, very broadly, both from, almost in the lens of the social determinants of health, thinking about the things that are necessary to, again, it goes back to support for education. Something like the Community Forward Schools program rarely gets covered, but that even is a precursor to economic inclusion, right? Giving extra resources to schools in historically underserved areas. The work we're doing with community health and the chain breakers for violence interruption. Again, if juvenile offenders don't get back on the track, they can't possibly be productive citizens. All the way up to more specific stuff, which is generally manifests as either workforce development, air quotes. We can dive into that, or of support for entrepreneurship. I'm proud of a lot of the work that we've done with the Atlanta Fed stood up this cohort called the Southern Cities for Economic Inclusion. And we've done a lot of really interesting work around defining the problem, but also responses to the problem. And the Builder's Blueprint program is probably the most impactful there. I mean, one of the things we've determined is that the way in which the licensure process is super complicated and itself is a barrier to entry, and a lot of minority entrepreneurs need help figuring out how to do that. A lot of it we're learning is going to change the way we do purchasing at the city. For example, breaking contracts down into smaller contracts so that they can qualify for the bond to get the job. We're actually reconfiguring that whole process inside the city to make it easier, and do a better job of tracking minority vendors. I mean, before all we were really doing was just issuing certificates saying congratulations, you're a minority contractor. But the Builder's Blueprint program is, the first cohort was fully enrolled, the second one's fully enrolled, and I think with all the, as you well know, with all the business we've got going on in Chattanooga, that's an incredible opportunity to build wealth in minority communities. At the same time, we're very focused on workforce development, and Chattanooga has two very, very poor census tracts, basically on the south side, Alton Park and parts of East Lake, that qualified for a $500,000 recompete strategy development grant. If we get the full recompete grant, it will make, and I think it's a $50 million grant. It will help. We'll make huge strides. And whether or not we get the grant, the processes we're putting in place support for childcare and income stipends so that people can upskill with job training. Those will be things we'll be looking for funds elsewhere to do. But those are the key strategies. We were part of a Department of Labor Good Jobs, Good Cities cohort, one of like 16 cities nationwide. I'm actually going to D.C. for the wrap-up meeting next week. And it has caused us to really do a deep dive into the entire workforce development system here, working with the county to reconstitute the workforce development board in the way that we approach the whole project from. We could really get in the weeds on this one, but the way that the federal subchapter WIOA works that subsidizes workforce development it isn't very effective. It's designed at a time when, very reactive. It's not focused on training. It's focused on mapping people over from one factory job to another factory job. There's a bill in Congress now to reform that. We're trying to provide input to make sure that it's done correctly. But I think what you can see is a much more intentional focus on job training to upskill people from lower wage jobs to higher wage jobs.
So one other point you've got under catalyzing economic vitality in the Black community is reducing recidivism rates.
Yeah.
And that is one that stood out to me because criminal trials and sentencing and everything, that's handled at the county and state level. And so I'm curious what impact the city has been able to have in reducing recidivism rates. What sorts of programs you have in place? Can you speak about that briefly?
Well, we used some ARPA funds to support both Project Return and I want to say the Brave Effect, Joe Jenkins program, because both of them are here. The Project Return started in Nashville and has opened a branch here, and really fortunate timing because they opened it, I want to say my first or second year in office. And they've been here since, and that is what they do. And prior to that, there was no nonprofit in Chattanooga working on that. We are not, again, our watchword here is to essentially use staff to catalyze the nonprofit community to kind of help fuel them and point them in the right direction. And that's the approach we're having to do here because we really don't have a department of recidivism reduction at the city. But it's a really, really important part of our strategy. And I think it is for the county as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I want to move on to ensuring affordable housing choices for all Chattanoogans. This is one area where I got the most questions about, hands down.
It's the biggest issue this area faces. There's no question.
And so I want to start, there's several different levels and effects of the lack of affordable housing here in Chattanooga. So I want to start with homelessness.
Yeah.
There was a pretty marked reduction in 2023. But since then, at least based on the last counts that I saw, homelessness rates seem to have stagnated. What do you see as the primary factors contributing to homelessness, and what is your administration doing to stem homelessness at the source?
Yeah. Well, the primary factors are, in fact, just increased rents, right? People, the evictions, it's a real thing, and it's invisible to most people, but as rents rise and people can't afford them and, people get out on the street. And that, I think, is, in fact, the primary driver. And, of course, that's true not just here but in the entire metropolitan area because when people do become homeless, they often come to Chattanooga from outlying areas because we have the resources, right? And I get a lot of stick from from certain quarters who perhaps lack a little bit of compassion, but understandably, right? People are concerned about our downtown. It has to remain economically viable. It needs to be safe. It is the most difficult thing to manage that any mayor faces, for sure. But look, we've got homeless services down here on 11th Street. I will say the county has a free homeless health clinic, which is probably the only thing that's extraordinary about our kind of infrastructure for homeless population here, to their credit, because it's not like some Ritz-Carlton place to be homeless, despite what you might hear from some quarters. That said, our Office of Homelessness and Supportive Housing has been doing a really great job getting people housed. I think they've housed over 3,000 people, which is a remarkable number. And so, look, again, as I've said many times, affordable housing and homelessness are two sides of the same coin. Anecdotally, we know too that we've seen police cars from Gadsden down there dropping people off. That does happen. We were concerned very much about people being bussed in from other cities. We did not move the Greyhound station. The Greyhound station was not paying any rent down there, and CARTA chose to, and which is how the Greyhound station wound up in Wildwood. We haven't seen a growth or decline since then, so we don't know how much a driver that might or might not have been. And then, anecdotally, there are some discharges from Moccasin Bend that we know who get stuck in Chattanooga. I mean, Moccasin Bend covers a massive service area in East Tennessee, and sometimes those discharges do not find a way home, which is a problem, and we've discussed that with the state of Tennessee. But the overall major driver is affordable housing. There's no question.
And to be clear, at the end there, you were speaking about the Moccasin Bend Mental Health Institution. That phrase encompasses a lot of different things.
No, the mental health.
Just
hospital.
for the listeners'
right.
clarity.
And we can cover that and that whole kit and caboodle in more detail later if you like. But yeah, I mean,
Absolutely.
we would like to see that hospital move for a number of reasons. Yeah, not least of which is that one.
So, in the same vein, the city has explored options for a permanent low-barrier shelter in the past.
Yeah.
There was the old CARTA warehouse down on 12th Street, I believe. That project seemed to stall a little bit based on public pushback,
Yep.
but is this still a priority for the administration? And if so, what is the status of those plans?
For sure.
What can you share about where that shelter might go or what the timeline looks like?
Yeah, it is. I mean, the neighborhood, unfortunately, really did not want to see that happen there. And the way in which, they had legitimate concerns. I had legitimate concerns. And so we have kind of dropped back and are taking another look with our friends so there's an interesting story behind how we have those temporary shelters down at Olivet on their extra property with Branch Technologies, a local company. We went over there for a visit, first year in office, and they showed us some shelters that they were working on as pilots for UN refugees, right? And the CEO and I were talking Platt and well, couldn't we maybe use those for affordable housing? And yeah, maybe we could, right? And so that's where that pilot came from. And lo and behold, Branch is now kind of looking at that as an entire business vertical because they're fireproof, which is the big concern. That's why we didn't do pallet shelters, which is the company out in Washington that does these kind of tiny home things, which is it's a better design to address the problem in that it gives people their own space, their own dignity, rather than these big congregate shelters. So we're working with Branch, on their latest version. And what we'd like to do is find a place where we can do that, whether it's on 12th or another place, serviced by another nonprofit. We're talking to the faith community about perhaps there's 1,000 acres of surplus land in Chattanooga. And if churches took on 2 or 3 of these, right, as part of their faith mission, we could put a big dent in the problem. So we haven't given up on it. We're just kind of spinning the wheel again and trying to improve the model. But in the meantime, we have OSH standing in the gap. And, look, we've still got we are now over the hump with the Ames Center Aspero project on 14th for permanent supportive housing, which is underway and should start soon. That's going to be 60 units of permanent supportive housing. We're going to be moving forward shortly with a new vendor at the Airport Inn, which is another 75 units of permanent supportive housing. So all these things are going to make a dent. And then at some point, I guess we'll, shift gears and talk about affordable housing itself,
right?
Which is a whole nother can of worms.
Yeah, so that is the next question, is affordable housing more broadly. It's not just people who are struggling with homelessness, but people who are, they can pay the rent, but it's painful, it's difficult. They don't know how much longer they can keep it up. They might not be able to live in the part of town that they want to live, et cetera.
Exactly.
So broadly speaking, what do you see as the primary factors to improving housing affordability across the board?
Well, I would put this right behind homelessness in terms of just complexity and difficulty. But I think a really interesting observation that you don't often see around affordable housing is that it's a fraction, right? It's housing cost over income. And so part of this, and part of the reason we have this problem, is back to the essential problem we try to address in the One Chattanooga plan, which is income disparity. between historically disadvantaged residents of Chattanooga and those who from wealthier backgrounds and increasingly those who are coming in from elsewhere at higher income levels, right? Which allows landlords to charge more, which just increases the disparity. So you can't really talk about this without also talking about workforce development.
Right.
But in the meantime, right, we have got to address this in a multivariate way. Bruce Katz actually just wrote a post the other day in his new localism blog about how complicated this is, and we in fact are part of a cohort to really look with the federal government at what needs to happen at the federal level to address this problem, which frankly, HUD has failed in this regard, right? The incentives we have right now, which essentially amount to tax incentives, LIHTC credits, are just not sufficient to address the problem. And hopefully in the next administration that will change. But we have a lot of other tools in the toolbox. I will say the most important one, and this is somewhat controversial, the newspaper ran a story a year or so ago about the fact that supply and demand doesn't address the problem. While I would take complete issue with that, it does address the problem. If you increase the supply, it will increase affordability. It's the immutable law of economics. And there's this concept of filtering, where, if you need a $900 apartment, there's a new $1,400 apartment that comes up, you can't afford it, but the person who rents a $1,400 apartment downsizes from a more expensive house, which then becomes available to two roommates. So this it works, right? I mean, if you increase supply, it will help affordability. So that's the first thing, and zoning reform and making the city easier to do business with definitely has a lot to do with that. However, we also need more incentives, right, directly for subsidized affordable housing. And we have made some great progress there, right? So the biggest one, I think the thing we're proudest of, is changing the state law, because prior to this legislative year, we could not offer incentives to developers to add affordable housing, right, in exchange for a zoning variance. Maybe they get another floor of affordable housing, or get another story on a building if they'll agree to add affordable housing. Maybe we, reduce the parking requirements. We couldn't do that before this year. We can now, so that will have an impact. We also changed the way we do pilot policies at the city, which before, and I know this is like for your audience, probably the only folks that will appreciate and understand this, but it matters, right? The pilot policies we had before was pretty useless. I mean, it required people to do something like, I can't remember if it was 50% at 80% AMI or 80% at 50% AMI, but it was monolithic, it wasn't scalable, and I don't think anybody ever took advantage of it, as long as the law was on the books. And so now it is scalable. If you want to do a little affordable housing, you get a little incentive. You want to do a lot, you'll get a lot. So these things will take a little while to kick in, but they will kick in and they will help. Two other things. One, just got a letter this morning, which has just made my heart so happy. Because when we passed, again, people outside the weeds of kind of municipal geekery may not understand or appreciate this stuff. But the ADU ordinance we passed last year was a big deal. Being able to do an ADU by right will have a huge impact on affordable housing if people will take advantage of it. And at the opening for Lynbrook Park the other day, I noticed somebody was remodeling a house along Lynbrook Park. By God, there was an ADU being built right in the backyard. And just this morning, right? Everybody that watches TV in Chattanooga sees these ads for Window World and so on. Great, right? Improve the quality of your house. Somebody probably needs to be out there running ads for ADUs, right? Because if you do an ADU and you can do an owner-occupied Airbnb, you're going to cash flow that thing almost immediately. It's going to increase the quality of your property. It's a hell of an opportunity for a contractor. And just this morning, I got a letter from a contractor saying, I'd love to come talk to you about promoting this. So it's working. It's going to work. Last but not least, what you'll see soon is the fruits of that Affordable Housing Trust Fund. We worked with a consultant to stand up a really clever way to essentially a debt instrument to get projects done by filling a capital gap for mezzanine debt with to get them to closing. And again, this is getting in the weeds, but once you get a project closed and built, you can go back and refinance it. And with conventional financing, or maybe philanthropy comes in with mezzanine debt. But that product will be available soon, and that will speed up a lot of projects as well. So again, it's a war on many fronts, but we are winning that war. You're just not, you're beginning to see it. I think we've seen the numbers turn down here recently in a way that we're not seeing in a lot of markets, but it's going to get a lot better sooner.
Right. So I guess to summarize, you're talking about increase in supply on the one side and then increase in subsidy where appropriate on the other side.
Precisely. We saved ourselves a lot of time if we had just said that. Yeah.
No, I love the detailed explanation, but just to provide a quick summary at the end, there's one thing that I've been hearing, especially with regards to the new zoning code, which does have a goal of increasing density, increasing supply, increasing housing choice. There are several residents who argue that expanding housing choices beyond single-family homes is detrimental to the quality of life, both for the person living in that new multifamily unit and for the people around them. How would you respond to that argument?
Well, this is a city. Again, Chattanooga is a city, and it's going to be built and behave like a city. Everybody gets to sort themselves out, right? Our zoning code is not the county's zoning code. I think this is a common misconception. I saw some letters to the Chattanoogan that just got it all wrong because what we're passing, just because the RPA, is headed up by Dan Reuter, that they work under contract for the county, and the area types in the county will not be, and certainly not in North Georgia, totally different, what's in the city. But the city of Chattanooga, needs more density. It's funny, the mayor of Fort Collins, Jenny Arndt, is a friend of mine, very left of center, certainly left of me. And I saw her at a meeting recently, and she was just shaking her head, and she said, the bananas are driving me crazy. I'm like, bananas? Do you know what that means? Yeah. Build absolutely nothing anywhere, never again. And the irony of it is, right, like you get these very liberal cities like Fort Collins and Austin where people are just, it's almost like this Rousseauian romantic idea that like we just kind of need to freeze time, and it's just not reality. Or San Francisco. That's how you get disasters, right? Because you don't keep up with demand. What I've heard from everybody in Austin is like, look, people are coming anyway. You can't do anything about it. You've got to meet it and meet it appropriately, and the way to meet it appropriately is density, right? So we will be more dense where density is appropriate, and we won't where it's not. It's not going to be the same all over the Chattanooga metropolitan area. But in downtown Chattanooga, you can certainly expect more density. And for those that don't, like Delta's ready when you are, right? Move to Cleveland, move to North Georgia. But Chattanooga's going to be this way.
Strong answer.
Yeah.
Good.
Well, that's it.
I want to move on to the next point in the One Chattanooga plan, which is improving local infrastructure and public transit. And I want to do two questions real quick, just rapid fire answers. What is the status of the traffic signal retiming efforts and the Wilcox Bridge replacement? Those are two big projects that have been announced. Yeah. People are excited for them, but there hasn't been a lot of news.
No,
about
there
where
has not. And again, all the old adages about the speed of government are essentially true. I mean, if you don't approach my job with a very aggressive, we'll just say that, posture and demeanor, nothing happens. I mean, I've learned that. And you got a lot of plates you got to keep spinning. Traffic timing was a classic example. I mean, as you know, it's one of the first things we talked about coming through the door. And it is happening. I mean, the timing study is happening later this year, and it'll start going on early next year. But that's how long it has taken, 3.5 years, to get this thing stood up. Wilcox Bridge, classic example. We got we got the grant. Everybody got all excited about it. The RFPs, now TDOT's handling that project, are going out in the winter of this year. That's when they're going out. Those metal plates are not the repair. I've seen the Reddit threads. Those are not the repair, right? That is simply what's there to kind of keep it up in the meantime. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating as hell to me. And it's just something we just kind of have to continue to push on and pound on and try to accelerate the timeline for. But they're advertising for the contractor in this winter. Construction's expected to be complete in 29. That's if I get a second term, that would be my last year in office. So this stuff takes a while. Now, again, signal retiming, to be more specific, you're going to see in early August, we're going to start using cameras to collect car counts. And retiming will start and be complete probably by the summer next year. And I will be dancing a jig because, as you know, I've been waiting on this for a long, long time. I will say part of this is we've been working much more closely with Google. They have a really interesting – there's so many reasons to retime traffic lights over and above being impatient, which is enough for me because I am. The sustainability argument is as clear as a day. And one of the things we discovered is that we had neglected, the details of public works infrastructure investment for so long that the boxes that control the lights were so out of date that we couldn't even take advantage of the services Google was offering. Mm-hmm. So we have to go out, and I had a really good conversation with Robert Hampshire. It's a great infrastructure investment opportunity for the federal government to help local municipalities change all those things out for essentially blade servers, so that Google can, exchange information through CPP with Waze and know, like, when to turn the lights. Like, that's the holy grail, and we will get there soon. Mm-hmm. So we're going to make, frankly, kind of a quantum leap from – it's going to be way better soon. Right.
Yeah. I think those are both really good updates, and these are things that – they fall out of the headlines. You announce the grant.
Well, that's why I'm glad you do this podcast.
That's a big headline.
Yep.
And people see that and they're like, okay, great. When is it going to happen?
Exactly.
And then there's this kind of black box that happens in the meantime.
Again, and I'm telling you, it's a good thing you are doing this because I'm not throwing, casting aspersions at other politicians or former mayors, but unless people are asking the questions, they many, many times in political jobs in a city government without a city manager, which we don't have, they do fall out of bed. I mean, I've got multiple examples I could give you, which we don't have time for, where we just have lost the plot from one administration to the next, and it just blows away and gets forgotten about or has to be dusted off and restarted later.
Right. That might be a great lead into this next question. I sometimes wonder if you regret doing the ad where you filled the pothole.
No, not at all.
No, you still stand by that. Awesome.
Because we filled 40,000 potholes. What I tell you, I think, and I know the public consciousness is not, it does not really seem to align with that. I think what I came to realize the other day, and this is this is not unique to government. But it is a bureaucratic thing. Inside city government, we're not distinguishing between potholes and badly sunk manhole covers and badly repaired sewer laterals. But 99% of people on the street don't give a damn, right? When you feel a bump, it's a pothole. If you go down Hickson Pike, which I do a lot, there are at least 6 badly repaired sewer laterals that will go, it's like, driving over a ladder. And so I'm like, guys, we got to treat that we can't treat. We have a pothole truck that goes out and fills actual potholes. Mm-hmm. All you got to do is dial 311. That is working, but that is not the entirety of the problem, right? So now, again, there's not another podcast, Nathan, where anybody would even ask this question or bother with the detailed answer. But the truth of the matter is that we have, again, for the future, we fixed this problem in that we now are changing through our wastewater division completely the way that we do bad sewer laterals. Mm-hmm. Before, and only an engineer would appreciate this, if you had a bad sewer lateral, you, Mr. Homeowner, had to fix it. Now, what would you do? You would be like, what? I've got to pay how much to go fix something out in the middle of the street? So what are you going to do? You're going to hire the cheapest Joe Blow contractor you can find. And what's he going to do? He's going to do the quickest, dirtiest job he can. And voila, you have a crappy sewer lateral that will be sunk and basically be a functional pothole in no time. And that is the history of this city's infrastructure up until last year or the year before that. Now, We are taking on that expense, and we will come out and fix it, and we will do it properly. But that's only on a going forward basis.
Right.
So what do we do about the tens of thousands of bad sewer laterals from dumb decisions city government made before that? Well, I mean, we got to go out there and fix them one at a time. And so we have to add that to the backlog of potholes and everything else. And again, we were spending $3 million a year before I came into office on paving and potholes generally, when we should have been spending $7 million. Mm-hmm. So the backlog is deep. And paving costs, unfortunately, and there are a lot of reasons for this, we could probably talk the rest of the podcast about it, have gone up 67%, right? We need more vendors doing paving supplies, which is a whole different problem. I mean, we're looking at possible anti-competitive trade practice and needing more bids. I mean, we've got to get the cost of those materials down. And again, if we can find extra money, we will certainly add to the paving budget. But we're spending $10 million a year on paving, which is 3 times what we spent. And so I expect, as we're able to find more surplus capital funds, we will contribute them, because the problem has gotten that much, the aperture's gotten bigger and the expense has gotten greater until we, start to make even more progress.
So what does that $10 million look in a miles paved number? And then what does that miles paved per year number look like compared to 4 years ago, 5 years ago?
I want to say, I know this year we expect to pave 49 lane miles. I want to say last year was 60. Again, it would be higher simply because the costs have gone up. Mm-hmm. But and again, there's thousands of lane miles in Chattanooga. So we, at the current rate, if expenses don't go down and we don't find more money, we would still not be up to a average good pavement condition index by the time I got out of office. That's how far behind we were, mm-hmm. even spending $10 million from my first year in office. So if we're going to make real progress here, then we're just going to have to find more money or reduce the expense to do it.
Right. So I want to move on to building I have one more question on local infrastructure. The city is committed to a substantial redesign of Fraser Avenue after the tragedy back in November. Mm-hmm. The process for this redesign was somewhat novel, at least here in Chattanooga. Mm-hmm. It was preceded by a quick build test using traffic barrels. They were up for about a month. CDOT took numbers. They studied how long it takes to travel using the new configuration versus the old, and then took that data and went back to a more permanent design. Noted urban design consultant Jeff Speck was also hired to make a final review of the plans, and some final tweaks are being made. Yeah. Is there any plan to replicate this process of tactical testing, public input, and intentional redesign going forward?
100%. I mean, again, the whole orange barrel thing was me. I mean, again, when we looked at this, I said, well, let's just go and try, right? We talk a lot about, I've mentioned in here, We the Possibility, right? This book about public entrepreneurship. And people drive around orange barrels all the time. Right? So why not just go out there and try this lane configuration on Fraser? And again, a lot of folks in Public Works looked at me like it was nuts. Just go do it, see what happens, and then we'll pivot from there. I mean, that's entrepreneurship. But again, that is a cultural shift inside the city of Chattanooga that is taking a lot more time than I anticipated. But it is happening, right? So we stood up. Again, the really frustrating thing about the tragedy on Fraser, in which those poor folks lost their lives, was that we had already stood up a task force to do tactical interventions on pedestrian safety, because we knew the numbers were going the wrong direction. And they just hadn't done anything to that point, because there's 1,000 reasons not to do anything, right? The APSCO Green Book just got revised, and there's always an answer as to why the status quo is perfectly okay, up to and including this really pernicious kind of feature, which is that, if it's outside the boundaries of what's considered to be standard urban design, then we actually may incur legal liability. So we can actually leave a situation more dangerous than an intervention we might make just to protect ourselves from liability, even though somebody could, it's like we could prevent somebody from getting hurt, and possibly get sued, or we could not prevent somebody from getting hurt, but we won't be sued, which is just dumb, right? The height of stupidity. And so thank God that the Green Book did get revised and became much more flexible. But at the same time, the Fraser Avenue was a demonstration project for me as much as anything. We were really fortunate. Again, design nerds may not appreciate just what a big deal it is that we got Jeff Speck here. And it was really kind of a stroke of genius from Dan Reuter, our planning guy, who said, because I was not entirely happy with the compromise. It's like the old saying about a camel being an animal designed by a committee. Kind of the last cut of the Fraser Avenue design was that, and he said, "Why don't we just bring in Jeff Speck and have him have a look at it?" I said, "That's a brilliant idea." And sure enough, what he came back with was brilliant. It really was, and it is, and I feel sure it has the best chance of balancing the needs of pedestrian safety and traffic throughput of anything that I've seen. And so, yes, we are expanding our scope of work with him to do a walkability study across the city, and you will definitely see more of those tactical interventions.
Well, I look forward to seeing what Fraser Avenue looks like in the future, and I look forward to seeing more of these tactical projects.
I should say, too, part of that is going to be, as we unfortunately have to close the Walnut Street Bridge for its redo, you're going to see some cool projects for alternate pedestrian pathways down and across Veterans and Market Street Bridge. And those are something that hopefully will be super cool in their own right. There'll also be public art projects, and we'll probably stick around even after Walnut is reopened.
Awesome. Can't wait to see it.
Yep.
So now I want to move on to building a competitive regional economy. During our interview last year, you pointed to airline access as a key factor in being an economically competitive city.
Yes.
Where do we stand on airline access?
Well, we're moving in the right direction. I mean, this is one that I don't think many people realize. The airport used to be a city department, as it still is in Denver, believe it or not. And the only relic we have from those days is that I make all the board appointments at the airport authority, and that is still a powerful position. And I appointed a lot of new board members, and we have a new CEO, and so it's a new day out there and a better day. And April Cameron, who's the new CEO, is doing a fantastic job. We've had the expansion project, which, to be fair, was already in place before I came into office, or was moving along. But we've got the SCASD grant to get air service to Denver. We are now trying to, essentially make a strategic choice as to which airline gets that, and weighing those. I don't think I'm at liberty to say which ones are which. Of course, we've added the Las Vegas flight. We're courting another major airline and talking to them about a route guarantee. Route guarantees are something that every competitive city around us has done. Greenville, Huntsville, Nashville, Knoxville. We've never done one. I mean, it's no wonder we're, as I say all the time relative to the airport authority, and I said this to the board, if you're playing poker and you can't spot the sucker around the table, you're the sucker. And we were. I mean, we had laps run around us, and yet we know that it matters to a lot of the companies we're trying to recruit. So we've got a lot of catching up to do. We're never going to be, Atlanta or Nashville, but we can get, I think, above the proverbial Mendoza line, where air service here is good enough, where at least it's not an obstacle to economic development. So I feel great about the direction we're headed in.
And we've already talked about a few things related to job training and your point that early learning is, in the long run, a huge impact on our local economy. So I don't want to spend too much time on this point. We've got about 15 minutes left and a lot to cover still. So I'm going to move on to closing the gaps in public health. The One Chattanooga plan has made a priority to ensure all Chattanoogans have access to fresh, healthy, and affordable food. That's word for word from the plan.
Yep.
What is your administration doing to attract groceries in underserved areas? And especially, I mean, we're seeing already grocery stores closing in one part of town, reopening another,
right,
and leaving a blank spot, really. It happened with the Walmart over in Brainerd, and then it's happening again with the 23rd Street Food City. So what can the administration even do?
Yeah, it's a tough problem, right? Because one of the things that's become clear, at one point we were looking at at a model where we would essentially go in and subsidize the operation of grocery stores. And it just does not have a great track record, right? I mean, part of this has to do with the dynamics of the grocery business itself. That has to do with one thing and one thing only, and that's our friend Sam Walton and the good old Walmart. Because as much as people know about the Walmart, they shop at the Walmart, right? And that consolidation has driven down margins and made it much more difficult. It's made the scale of grocery stores larger. And so they're going to consolidate and move into areas and kind of leave behind a little bit of a tide, of what looks like abandoned areas. I'd say there are two things we're looking at seriously now, one of which is a lot easier than the other. The first is talking to CARTA and Food City very specifically about whether we can introduce a voucher program with the Caravan program or the Car2 Go program to actually get people to the grocery stores rather than taking people the grocery stores to them, right? I mean, Car2 Go is essentially it's like an Uber bus. And that is something that the economics of that can be somewhat challenging. It may not work out, but it makes a lot more sense to me. If I'm Food City or Publix or any other grocery store that wants to participate, I mean, they send out coupons all the time. And you tell me you're going to bring somebody who's going to spend an average of, $150 on groceries, it's probably worth a couple of bucks, right? So they may be willing to subsidize those routes and get people to the grocery stores. So that's how we're thinking about that. Secondly, again, we do have, there's the grocery store in East Chattanooga has changed providers to an IGA, which is a co-op model. That is certainly the most scalable model for, individual entrepreneurship, ownership in communities, and we'd love to support that. The problem is you just don't have a lot of people wanting to go out there and open grocery stores. Conventional grocery stores, which is a segue to the last point, and this is one that's probably going to raise some eyebrows. I think what you'll find if you drive in a lot of these areas is that Latino entrepreneurs have actually filled these gaps, but there's a cultural barrier, right? If you will go up and down Main Street, right, you can get what you want at a lot of these tiendas. And it's no big deal. They'd love to have your money. But non-Latin people a lot of times are like, well, I don't know about that. I don't need to walk in there. I would encourage everybody to walk in. They have everything you would want. A lot of times it's cheaper than you'd find it anywhere else. And so, again, the problem is really not as bad as you'd think. It's just that, there's not a brand new Food City in my neighborhood anymore. Well, okay. But there's not actually a food desert if you will avail the opportunities available to you. And again, I do. I go to the Loa down on Main and Market pretty often, and it's a great road. You can get whatever you need in terms of basic staples in there, or any of those places that you might find. So, and look, we need more sort of cultural integration anyway. So I would encourage people that are concerned about it to walk in there and spend a couple of bucks, and I think what they'll find is that their business is very welcome there.
So I want to talk about another question that I struggled with where to put this, honestly. Is this under infrastructure? Is this under public health? But pedestrian injury rates remain high.
Yes.
Last year was one of the highest on record, if not the highest,
Yep.
and we're on track to exceed that this year. Yep. Statistically, these injuries occur most frequently in lower-income communities.
Yeah.
Your budget this year set aside $500,000 for pedestrian safety improvements.
Yep.
And that could mean a lot of small projects that are just little tweaks here and there, or it could mean a small portion of one big project like repaving a street. I mean, Fraser is probably going to cost a few $1 million. $500,000 is... It's nothing, but
it's not. That's not much more than that, because it's really just a lot of rubberized paint, But anyway.
So what is the process for determining how that $500,000 gets spent, and what are the metrics that are going to be used to define whether this $500,000 has been spent well?
Well, the metrics are the metric that you mentioned is going to be pedestrian deaths and injuries, right? It is the one metric we track. It's certainly going in the wrong direction, and that's why we put the money in the fund. I expect that the money will, in fact, be used for smaller interventions, right? I mean, we've had a lot of help from the foundation world as well. God bless them on what we're trying to do with Fraser, and I imagine we'll be looking at Brainerd Road right through the tunnels. Those larger projects will have their own budgets, but the idea for the fund and the idea for the task force came actually. Probably the first execution was we added flashing across signals on Georgia Avenue. We had an elderly couple that got hit there, and I kind of lost it and was like, guys, what the hell are we doing? I went to a municipal expo, and now they're making these LED solar powered crosswalk signals. They're $5,000 to $8,000 a piece. Let's go put those in places where they need to be put in. Do something, right? I mean, there's got to be a higher level of urgency around this stuff. And so that's what that money's for, is for more of those smaller tactical interventions.
Great. I look forward to seeing those.
Yep.
Have you considered the implementation of a Vision Zero program in Chattanooga, an official designation?
I don't know about I think we have for quite some time. I think if Melissa Taylor were sitting here, she would tell you we've been guided by that for years before I came into office. But yes, I mean those are the metrics and the guidelines that we're working with now.
Mm-hmm. So last section, providing responsive and effective local government. Real quick answer, just kind of general timeline. Yeah. Where is the city website redesign?
Almost there. I mean, literally, I would say probably mid-September.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Next is that the One Chattanooga plan has made a priority to advocate for local control over local issues at the state and national level. You've already pointed to one great example about housing affordability and being able to provide density benefits and other incentives when people provide affordable housing. What other issues are you advocating for at the state and national level?
Well, we're big parts of the Tennessee Municipal League, and TML, as you might imagine, works very hard on this. I mean, one of the things we're really advocating for is a return of more local sales tax dollars. We did a study with Chris Acuff's help on capital funding for mid-sized cities, and very frankly, we're at a massive disadvantage relative to, let's say, Huntsville, who gets back, straight down the line, probably 4% of their sales tax. We get back 1.1 cents, and the state keeps 6. Right, and which means we just have to kind of go back and beg the state for money, and the state continues to just pile up money. I mean, we had $1 billion charge-off settlement for franchise and excise tax this year, and still managed to have a balanced budget, right? I mean, that would be a fiscal crisis in the other state, which is a tribute to the state of Tennessee. But the balance, it's out of balance, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of it has to do with, and we've said, look, we were happy to designate the restoration of those sales tax dollars to raises for police and fire, and because we continue to struggle to fund the raises we need to keep up with inflation, and it's just a problem of how those sales tax dollars are allocated. So the fiscal piece is the most important piece of that. There are a bunch of other examples, but I think the example of what we were able to do with Senator Gardenhire around the housing reform was a really good example of how, if you don't approach something from a polemical angle, assuming that the people on the other side of the aisle, and by the way, I'm right square in the middle of the aisle, right? I mean, again, I'm looking at what's best for cities and what does it take to run the city better. But we approached that from that fashion, and lo and behold, we got something done. So, but anything that's going to handcuff us in an unreasonable way and result in worse outcomes I'm going to have a problem with.
Mm-hmm. So next question is, the resignation of former police chief Murphy has necessitated a search for a new police chief.
Yep.
I don't want to spend too much time on this because other outlets are covering, the charges and the trial and all that stuff. I don't want to get into that here. But in the past, your administration has undertaken nationwide searches for key positions, such as the head of CARTA, Parks and Outdoors, and Chief Murphy was the result of a nationwide search as well. Mm-hmm. You've now announced that you'd like to make this an internal promotion.
Well, okay, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm wondering, first of all, is this specific to the police position for a particular reason that you can explain that it needs to be an internal hire? And then, If not, is this indicative of a different kind of strategy moving
look,
forward
it's not
with hires?
news, right? I mean, again, it's been made news because there is a certain element that really, really, really wants an internal candidate. Now, that said, I really want an internal candidate. Our bias was towards an internal candidate when we hired Chief Murphy. We always come into it. And that's true across city government. We would always rather grow our own talent, always and forever. But it's not, again, coming from a municipal infrastructure that was, less than well managed. It's just not reality always that the best candidate is going to be an internal candidate. But that's always, always, always going to be the preference. So there's really nothing new here. It's not. It's just not new. So, again, in this case, if we have the best candidate that is internal, that's the person we're going to choose, all things being equal.
So, I mean, based on that answer, are you still open to a candidate from outside Chattanooga?
Of course. Yes.
And this is something, again, I mean, it gets to how headlines get written and everything. Yeah. That might not be clear to
because
most people reading the
this all
headlines
came out of a comment that my chief of staff made in council chambers that was, a fairly anodyne statement saying just what I said. Our bias is always going to be towards an internal candidate. That's it.
Right.
And it always is. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to consider outside candidates or that we're not going to hire the best and most qualified person for the job.
Mm-hmm. That's a good clarification.
Yeah.
I'm glad that's out there now.
Yep.
The next question, honestly, a little awkward for me personally. I am a member of the Planning Commission.
Yeah.
You appointed me 2 years ago, I think, and confirmed by City Council.
Yep.
But there has been a lot of questions about your process for selecting board positions, not just for Planning Commission, but for any board, and ensuring equitable representation.
Yeah.
Planning Commission in particular does get a lot of flack. There's been several op-eds in the Chattanoogan basically saying that Planning Commission is full of industry insiders and good old boys.
Yeah.
And honestly, I'm a member of the development community.
Right.
I'm a civil engineer. I sit on the Planning Commission.
Right.
I recuse myself from cases that involve my company, and that's how I handle that.
And that's the way to handle that.
And that's the way most everybody else on the
Yes.
Planning Commission seems to handle it.
Yeah.
But there's still this reputation of industry insidership. And so I'm curious what your process is for board selections and how you see that. Do you think Planning Commission is stacked too heavily one way or the other? Or do you think that critique holds water?
No. That's the short answer. I mean, first of all, we, for the very first time in city history that I'm aware of, have actually achieved reflective representation of the community across boards and commissions, both in terms of gender and race. It's never been done before, right? I mean, so this idea that it's some old boy thing is absurd, right? But relative to Planning Commission, look, we have a board of plumbing examiners. Do you think I'm going to hire a librarian to sit on the board of plumbing examiners? I am not. I mean, come on. And so, yes, the people on the Planning Commission have to be people who are familiar with the process. This stuff is kind of inside baseball, right? So there's always going to be a dynamic tension in areas like this between people who have requisite industry knowledge to be able to do the job well and understand the issues, and people who can appropriately recuse themselves from situations. So, and that's true in every city, in every country across the world, right? So, again, you read the Chattanoogan, you may as well read social media. I mean, the opinions, the old saying about opinions, come on. I mean, it's next. I mean, come on.
So I'd like you to talk a little bit more, zooming out to boards more broadly.
Yeah.
You talked about getting relative parity with kind of the population of Chattanooga representation. How is that going? You said it's every board now, or some boards?
Again, I think people may not realize how many boards there are.
There's a lot.
There's a lot, and a lot of people, and so it's tough to make sure that. So we haven't had really a chance to talk about it, but your podcast, I think you probably remember. I don't know where I was standing in my bathroom when I called you because I had heard a report about what you were doing. I was like, man, I'm so glad this guy's doing this because people need to be more tuned into local government. And since that time, We've helped, the Enterprise Center stand up Chatham Matters. We've got this new show coming out called The Chattanooga Show that David Littlejohn's working on. We've got Cha TV on EPB. Mm-hmm. We're trying to use every avenue and support every channel we can to make people aware of local government and to make sure that people are aware of those opportunities, whether it's serving on a neighborhood advisory board mm-hmm. or the Board of Plumbing Examiners or the Planning Commission. So it's back to supply and demand. If people aren't aware of the opportunities, we need a larger pool. And frankly, we're getting a lot of really great and qualified applicants for these. And staff vets them. We have 3 people sign off on them, including me. Of course, I get the final sign off. But we have a really good process in place, and I've been really impressed with the quality of the applicants.
Great.
Yeah.
So one last question. This comes from a patron.
Mm-hmm.
With all the drama at the federal level, local civic life and its relatively nonpartisan pragmatism seems an appealing arena for Chattanoogans to focus on.
Yes.
In what ways is the city insulated from the federal and state drama, and what ways is it not? And how can we all stay most productive in this environment? It's
an excellent question, and it goes to literally. I mean, look, I ran as much as anything for mayor for again, it's an exciting project to me. I really believe in the potential of the city. I read a book, which I've said 1,000 times, I would recommend it to anybody who hasn't read it, called The New Localism. And the thesis of that book, if you read that book, you will get the answer to your question. It's essentially that cities have more power than they've ever had to make great lives for their residents. I would remind people that, the classical Athens, Greece was about the size of Chattanooga, right? Great things can come out of cities this size. Because of these revolutions in technology and finance. And look, we have people across the ideological spectrum working in this office. We have partisan Republicans, we have partisan Democrats. It never comes up in here because there is no Republican or Democratic way to take the garbage out on time. And as Ed Peduto, the mayor of Pittsburgh, former mayor, said, there's really 3 political parties in the United States: Republicans, Democrats, and mayors. And I'm telling you, it is so rare unless... now gun policy, okay, right? Like, I'm sorry, but like we're living as actually a Republican legislator who shall remain unnamed, who I was complaining to about the tremendous number of guns on the street that are out there. And I'm a hunter and I'm a gun owner, but the pressure that puts on our police department, I said, it's like gun smoke, and she's like, well, it was a she, but she said gun smoke. The difference is Marshall Dillon could ask you to check your guns, at the city line in Gunsmoke. We can't even do that, right? So that stuff does bleed into local government, and I definitely have a problem with it. And I would love to see some meaningful reform around gun laws, common sense stuff. But the vast majority of, if you think about what constitutes quality of life, is local, right? Good jobs, good schools, good roads, public safety, all of that, parks, outdoors, it's all local. So if people are getting freaked out by the national political environment, I really think in a way we're kind of living George Orwell's 1984 in that, there are real psychological, structural problems with a political duopoly, right? Because it plays to a flaw in the human mind of a false dichotomy where things are either red or blue, they're black or white. And it's wrong. It's not reality, but it's an appealing, cartoon for small minds. And so I would just ask people to turn off their damn televisions for a little while and talk to their neighbors and go to a local park or talk to the people they're sitting with at their kids' ball game, and you will find that stuff falls to the wayside.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for your time. We have covered a lot of ground.
Yes, we have. Thank you.
So if you have made it to the end, congratulations.
Yeah. And for your patience.
I look forward to our next interview. Hopefully,
as do I. We'll have a lot more good stuff to report.
Great.
Thanks, Nathan.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Chattanooga Civics. Our music was written and recorded by Kevin MacLeod. Find more civic resources at ChattanoogaCivics.com. Chattanooga Civics is a member of the Podnooga Network. To find more great podcasts from local creators, find Podnooga on Facebook and Instagram or on the web at podnooganetwork.com. Thanks for listening.